Tonight's talk is about a unique collection of modern art in a Cambridge home. This is the first time the collection will have been seen and discussed publicly, and I am personally very excited to hear the talk tonight. There will be a short video followed by a talk by Matt Retallick, and then after a 15-minute break, we will open the floor to questions and answers. Matt Retallick is a curator, writer, and art historian based in Liverpool. He has worked at a variety of galleries and cultural institutions, including the Whitworth, Modern Art Oxford, the Turnpike, Hauser and Wirth, Haunch of Venison, and Colnaghi. Matt regularly writes on art and culture for organisations such as Art UK, and his slim volume, St Ives Modernism, was published in 2020 by the Modernist Society, of which he is an honorary lifetime member. Currently, Matt is researching for a PhD on the artist Karl Veschke at the Manchester School of Art. So without further ado, I will hand you over to Matt Retallick.
Thank you, Sally, and good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for joining me this evening. Thank you also to the friends and the staff of Kettle's Yard, in particular to Sally, for the kind invite to talk to you all this evening, and to the collectors of the Cambridge home for suggesting me. I felt off that I should start with a brief introduction and introduce myself, even though Sally just has. I am Matt Retallick. I am a curator, art historian and writer based in Liverpool. Originally from Cornwall, I have a passion for Cornish art history, in particular around what has become known as St Ives Modernism. I've just entered the final year of my PhD, what will be the first in-depth scholarly study of the painter Karl Veschke, and there'll be more on him and his connections to Kettle's Yard later. I hope this talk will be easy to understand and serve as an introductory guide to the collection of a Cambridge home. Obviously, it's quite a challenge to show artworks via the medium of Zoom, so my talk this evening will offer a mixture of visual analysis, biographical detail and anecdotes, whilst charting connections between each artwork. I hope that it's also a chance for the collectors to learn something new about the artworks they own and the context in which they were made. We'll begin by watching a short walkthrough video of this unique private collection of art in Cambridge. I will then chat for around 40 minutes, and then we'll have a screen break, and when we return, culminate with a discussion and questions. If any questions spring to mind throughout this talk, please feel free to type them in the Q&A box or the chat box, and these will be gathered by Sally, who has kindly agreed to mediate this evening. This is also your chance, possibly your only chance, to put questions to the collectors. I will be in contact with them via WhatsApp to receive their answers for you, and we sort of aim to keep those Eurovision style delays to a minimum. Cornwall is of course our theme for the evening, and therefore this talk will chart connections to the county for artists that some of you will know and others that you may not recognise. Some artworks are made outside the county, some in fact outside the country, but nonetheless Cornwall is a unifying factor. The Cambridge home collection is wonderfully vast, and therefore I couldn't include everything tonight, but I hope you enjoy the selection. Without further ado then, let's watch a short video which is a couple of minutes long, and it will allow you to see the artworks in situ and should give you a valuable sense of scale. I wanted to begin my talk this evening with this painting by Adrian Stokes titled Olive Trees in Mistral from 1937. As I will later explain, I tend to see Stokes as this gatekeeper of St Ives modernism, and this work is of particular interest to me as it was made a year after Stokes had first started painting. He is of course primarily known to many of you, I'm sure, as a writer and critic with books such as Stones of Rimini from 1934 and The Image in Form from 1972. During the mid-1930s, Stokes was making regular trips to Cornwall, captivated by its ancient landscape, and in 1938 he moved to Carbis Bay with the artist Margaret Mellis, who he had married in the same year, and we'll see more from her later. This painting is a typical example of one by Stokes in this period. He was interested in how a landscape tells a story for its many layers, its geology, its palimpsest scars of activity, both natural and man-made. Stokes said he started painting as he felt that nobody was painting the sort of landscapes he felt needed to exist. To quote from Tate, he sought an objective art, but one in which the painting's formal character was independent from the motif, end quote. Stokes felt at this time that abstraction only meant a separation from subject matter, and that in retaining the object, in this case a familiar landscape, he would achieve an independent and objective art. He believed in a harmonious use of colour, contrasting but not dominant, and in this painting that's certainly the case, with opalescent hues melting into each other to give the feeling of a landscape full of the ghosts of the past. It is often suggested that Stokes' interest in psychoanalysis is present in the paintings of this period, and I paraphrase from Tate again, who suggests that the spatial relations of these paintings represent the accumulation of past and present experience of the individual and the land. Of course, Cornwall isn't renowned for its olive trees, and the Mistral winds position us immediately in Mediterranean climes. This work was painted in Rapallo on the Italian Riviera. Much like Cornwall, however, it's a place on the edge, and I believe this is certainly the appeal for Stokes. I referred to Stokes as a gatekeeper earlier, and I do so because it was he and Mellis that invited Barbara Hepworth and Ben Nicholson to Cornwall on the outbreak of the Second World War. And this brings me on to my next work this evening by Ben Nicholson. This is 5 Circles and Squares in 1934, a woodcut print from an edition of 50, which was published in Paris. And I think I'm right in saying that this was Nicholson's only woodcut for that matter. There was a later printing of this in the early 1960s, but this is one of the originals and a fine example at that. It's also worth noting here that there are 2 proof versions of this print in the Kettle's Yard collection. Nicholson and Hepworth made the move to Cornwall in 1939. At first, they stayed with Stokes and Mellis at Little Park Owls, their home at Carbis Bay, before they found a place of their own, a 15-minute stroll along the coast. I am interested in this woodcut because it represents something of the constructivist clarity that Nicholson, Noun Garbo, and Leslie Martin would later lay out in their book Circle, International Survey of Constructivist Art, 3 years after the making of this print in 1937. Although never intended as such, the book became a sort of manifesto and certainly laid the foundations for the theoretical thrust of dominant voices of St Ives modernism. However, wartime is not the best place for constructivist clarity, and both Nicholson and Hepworth had somewhat abandoned their vision, at least temporarily, mainly due to financial necessity. Hence a transition to the patriotic landscapes of the 1940s, which many of us will have seen. These landscapes return to Nicholson's pre-war interest in a naively presented landscape inspired by Alfred Wallace. One such example is the drawing Boats in St Ives Harbour from 1945, also in the Kettle's Yard collection. Interestingly, this woodcut is on a much bigger sheet of paper, but the collectors had the white paper border reduced to fit into their domestic setting. Some clever conservation-friendly origami at play there, I think. Now let's move on to the aforementioned Alfred Wallace with our next work. As you are a Kettle's Yard audience, you will no doubt be very familiar with the globally significant collection of works by Alfred Wallace held at the gallery. What excites me as an art historian who works with Cornwall is the provenance of this artwork. Titled Houses and Trees, like many Wallace paintings, it is undated. This painting was first owned by the artist Sven Berlin, who later gifted it to potter Bernard Leach. And on the back of this work is a handwritten note in Leach's hand to that effect. Sven Berlin wrote a biography of Wallace in 1949 titled Alfred Wallace Primitive. Of course, the word primitive is used a lot in relation to Wallace's paintings, but I feel that they are in many ways deeply sophisticated. They are, after all, about memory and the recollections of a life lived. For example, the memory has a habit of enlarging the things that are important to us. And I feel that's exactly what's happening in Wallace's paintings. Wallace is, of course, known for his depictions of the sea and fish, of boats and shipwrecks, but I love the dark claustrophobia of this landlocked work. As Wallace grew older, he became increasingly paranoid and troubled by visions. For example, he is said to have believed that the devil was living upstairs in his St. Ives cottage. With this in mind, I can't help but wonder what might be lurking behind those trees. Of course, art history will have you believe that Ben Nicholson heroically plucked Wallace and his paintings from obscurity on a visit to the town of Christopher Wood in 1928. However, Wallace was already very much well known in West Cornwall, and his works were regularly changing hands and being, for the most part, displayed proudly. Admittedly, there were many who thought they were hideous, but that's art for you, we all know that. In saying that, it's probably worth pointing out here that I doubt Wallace ever saw his paintings in terms of art. And I quote from Matthew Gale in his book on Wallace, who backs this up. He writes, and I quote, "Wallace lay outside the strata of society in which art was habitually given a value distinct from its constituent materials and labour. He regarded his own work as a hobby comparable to storytelling or model making," end quote. Nicholson certainly made him known to the modernist chattering classes of Hampstead, but the fact Wallace, who died in a workhouse in 1942, had to be saved from a pauper's burial by Berlin and Leach is quite telling. If you haven't seen it and you find yourself in St. Ives, do visit the Barnoon Cemetery behind the Tate, where you can see his grave topped with hand-painted Leach tiles with the simple epitaph, "Alfred Wallace, artist and mariner." This work has been described by the collectors as an entry drug, a catalyst that determined the trajectory of the collection, one that forms a bridge between the folk art, pottery and craft and the other artworks that they own. The so-called discovery of Wallace leads me neatly to Christopher Wood, and there are two works by him in the Cambridge Home collection, Footbridge over the Seine from 1924 and Ballet Dancers from 1926, both seen here on screen. As we know from the previous slide, Wood was friends with Nicholson and Hepworth and made frequent visits to Cornwall. The Ballet Dancers were drawn in 1926, the year he first met them, as was Paris Snow Scene in the Kettle's Yard collection. Wood had moved to Paris in 1921, and Footbridge over the Seine was one of a series of works depicting French bridges. The image of the ballet dancers seen here was the original drawing that was reused by Wood, for example, as a white gouache and black paper that he titled Ballet Interval. But I love that sense of the backstage here, and the following quote from Boris Kochnow in 1979 reveals why this theme and that of the performance may have been appealing to him. My quote here: "At night, like an actor leaving the stage, Kit Wood rediscovers his real life, that of a solitary artist. To paint, he isolates himself from his friends who suspect nothing of his creative anguish or his escape into a world of dreams," end quote. And I suppose that anguish here is a very appropriate word. In Paris, Wood became acquainted with artists such as Picasso and Jean Cocteau, and Cocteau was responsible for introducing Wood to opium, and it was his later addiction and withdrawal to it that ultimately led him to take his own life in August 1930, tragically throwing himself under a train in Salisbury. I must say that I'm really pleased to see that Kettle's Yard have recently obtained a wonderful Christopher Wood drawing titled The Playground, a bustling beach scene from 1928, and I look forward to seeing that in person when I can. Now, in a slight aside, let's return to Carbis Bay and visit Margaret Mellis. There are three works by Margaret Mellis in the Cambridge Home collection. Firstly, White Anemone from 1957, and then Blue Angel Construction and City of Atlantis, both of which are undated but are from the early 1980s. You can see White Anemone and Blue Angel Construction on screen. In a May 1971 letter, Mellis explained the impulse for her series of anemone paintings, of which this is one. She said they were, and I will paraphrase here, painted from the idea of the shape of dying anemones, using irregular squared shaped patches of paint and bent lines of colour, usually unmixed direct from the tube. No modulations were allowed except by the density of the paint on each patch. To get the right density, the paint was put on with a palette knife in places and brushed on in others, which you can see here. And although this painting and the two constructions were not made in Cornwall, they are certainly rooted in the county. The constructions have their foundations and influence in her friendship with Ben Nicholson and another Carbis Bay resident, Naum Garbo. Mellis left St. Ives in 1946, following the breakdown of her marriage, and on leaving Cornwall, she almost ceremoniously abandoned abstraction. The anemone paintings in particular show a gradual return to the abstract, and by the 1970s, representation was once again pushed aside. These works formed of found material, for example, driftwood, also influenced the early work of a young disciple, Damien Hirst. The Cambridge home collectors met Mellis at Newlyn Art Gallery in the mid-1980s, and this began a passion for her work. They told me that of the moment that they first saw Mellis chatting with Wilhelmina Barnes-Graham at an exhibition preview. Now, with Damien Hirst's small mention there, let's stay with big personalities and turn our attention to Peter Lanyon. I talk about Peter Lanyon after Mellis, as Lanyon moved into Little Park Owls, the former home of Mellis and Stokes, in 1955. This work from the Cambridge Home Collection is titled Ancero d'Anticoli from 1954. Between late January and the end of April 1953, Lanyon rented a house in Anticoli Corrado, a town in the Rufi Mountains to the east of Rome. Living on very limited means, he painted small works, and the colour palette here is typical of those made there, with mainly dull hues evoking the winter months. Curiously though, the date is 1954, which suggests to me that this must have been painted in Cornwall. I'm guessing therefore that it came after a series of sketches or studies made in Italy, or maybe it is a work in progress that was completed on his return to the county. It was also probably painted very early in 1954, as in April and May that year, Lanyon had suffered a debilitating depression that left him unable to work. You can imagine Lanyon yearning for his time in Italy, and there's plenty of evidence to suggest that he was often fed up and disillusioned with St Ives at this time. In a letter to the artist Terry Frost, dated the 30th of April 1953, Lanyon describes what Anticoli meant for his painting. My developing sense of the purely sensuous in painting and life would seem to conflict with the complicated structure which society makes to hold this in check. I'm developing an aversion for the manners which cloak animal intentions and getting a strong taste for the primitive tongue which operates bodily and massively, mainly by instinct. That is Anticoli, end quote. And there's quite a funny story about this work. The collectors told me when they excitedly purchased it, they quickly found that it wouldn't fit in their soft top car. So precariously, they held it onto the roof, one hand each out of either side window whilst traveling home on the motorway. The things we do to own art. Later in the year this was painted in 1954, Lanyon founded the St Peter's Loft School with Terry Frost and Bill Redgrave. They would take young artists under their wing, particularly if they were working against the constructivist abstraction they felt was so alien to Cornwall. In 1955, Karl Veschke moved to Cornwall, and not only did he become a student at the school, but he was enlisted as a tutor. Karl Veschke is, of course, an artist very dear to my heart. I've just entered the final year of my PhD, focusing on him and his work. And it's worth noting here that there is also a connection to Kettle's Yard, as in 1980, he had a solo exhibition at the gallery titled Karl Veschke, Paintings and Drawings since 1974. Veschke, who was born in Gera in Germany in 1925, spent his early years in the children's home, then found belonging in the Hitler Youth, and then joined the Luftwaffe at the age of 17. He found himself in Britain as a prisoner of war in 1945. He was in a succession of camps, but it was his time at Radwinter student camp near Saffron Walden in 1947, and their focus on rehabilitation and education that set him on a course to being an artist. For example, across an 8-week period, the prisoners were taken by truck to Cambridge University and given a choice of subjects to study. Veschke selected an art history course at St John's College. His biography is extremely complex, and if you'd like to know more, I've recently written an article for Art UK, which is available on their website. Veschke moved to Cornwall in 1955 after a chance meeting with Bryan Wynter in a Soho bar, who then helped find him a cottage near Zena. He moved further west to Cape Cornwall in 1960 and remained there until his death in 2005. There are 4 works by Veschke in the Cambridge Home Collection: Study of Jan from 1958, Untitled Black Clouds from 1965, an undated work titled Brown Sea Painting, and Study for a Lighting, also undated. I'd like to focus on Study of Jan and Untitled Black Cloud, shown here. Study of Jan is one of a series of works that are often mistaken for landscapes, but that's very interesting considering his contact with Lanyon, who was known for painting the bodily experience of his surroundings. Veschke had also spent time in London with the students of David Bomberg, in particular Dorothy Mead being one example. And this influence is evident in the angular, dense and slightly brash manner the bodily form is presented. As you can see, this is something that translates in a more refined way 7 years later to Untitled Black Clouds. Almost all of Veschke's paintings in some way are rooted to the turbulence and displacement of his childhood and the ghosts of his past. He used the visual language of the Penwith landscape to work through themes of loss, violation and injury. So, for example, dark clouds, gorse flowers, jagged rocks, barren sands are reoccurring themes. My PhD will hopefully integrate him properly into art history, but as you can tell, he certainly sits apart from the gleeful, light-filled artist we readily associate with St Ives and the wider Penwith. When asked by a student if the Cornish lights had inspired him, he replied, "Cornish lights, I've got a 60-watt light bulb and I keep my curtains closed," which is one of my favourite quotes. Next up, another European emigre, Paul Feiler. Much like Karl Veschke, Paul Feiler is German. He was born in Frankfurt am Main in 1918. His family moved to London in 1936, with his father setting up a practice as a dentist on Harley Street. In 1953, he purchased a disused chapel in Kerris near Newlyn, which functioned as a holiday home until he moved there permanently following retirement in 1975. Feiler was head of painting at West of England College of Art in Bristol, and he regularly invited painters such as Veschke and Lanyon to teach at the school. The work we see here is Lunatis 8 from 1968. The Lunatis series, the name probably a slight giveaway, was very much inspired by the space race to the moon. And of course, Apollo 8 was launched in the same year, achieving a lunar orbit and return. Feiler has certainly picked up on the visual language of constructivist abstraction with his spare and geometric composition. The dark half circle to the left is the Earth, the grey circle, the moon, which matches illustrations of the mission's progress shared widely in newspapers and on television at the time. In this knowledge, the black rectangle can be read as the spacecraft. An impressive American achievement, which now gives me the excuse to segue into a small connection between Feiler and Mark Rothko here. In August 1959, Rothko arrived in Cornwall and stayed with Peter Lanyon for a few days. Whilst there, he visited Feiler in his chapel, and an inspired Rothko very nearly purchased a similar chapel near Lelant, which is just outside St Ives, with the intention of creating a Rothko chapel. Of course, no purchase was made, but I can't help but wonder what Rothko's presence in Cornwall would have meant for the progression of its painting. It's also worth mentioning here that there is a small collection display currently on view at Tate Britain titled St Ives circa 1959, curated by Andrew Wilson, which is very worth checking out, and Feiler, Lanyon, and our next artist, Sandra Blow, are featured. So here is an untitled work by Sandra Blow from 1959, the year of Rothko's visit. In 1957, Blow moved to Cornwall. At first, she stayed with Patrick Heron and then moved a short walk downhill to Higher Tregerthen, staying there for just over a year. She lived next door to Karl Veschke, and I believe that his painting was an influence on works such as this, particularly in terms of colour palettes with muddy ochre shades. When I first saw this work, for example, it instantly reminded me of the colours of the Penwith moors. This was, however, painted on her return to London, but I imagine it refers in some way to recent times in West Cornwall, with that dark arch like a shadow across the landscape. This is something that Michael Bird certainly suggests in his superb book, The St Ives Artist, which I highly recommend. And I'll quote from that book here. Blow carried the colours of mist, moss and granite from Zena to the Fulham Road, end quote. In the late 1940s, Blow lived in Italy and was briefly in a relationship with the artist Alberto Buri. They travelled throughout the country together. Although she made no work whilst there, the influence of Buri would certainly remain for the rest of her life. For example, the use of Hessian sacking, sand and straw. And this painting is certainly a case in point, with ashes and grit mixed into the oil, giving a highly textured and rough surface. The visible flecks you can see on this close-up photograph. Blow moved back to Cornwall and settled in St Ives in the mid-1990s, remaining there until her death in 2006. In the last slide, Patrick Heron got a brief mention. His house, Eagle's Nest, just outside Zena, sits above the cottages of Higher Tregerthen, where Sandra Blow and Karl Veschke lived in the late 1950s. This is Dividing Emerald and Brown, November 1971. It's a typical example of a heron from the early 1970s. Although rooted in past works such as about the Penwith landscape and natural form, It's easy to forget that Heron himself in the 1960s described his work as having, and I quote, "colour as both the subject and means, the form and content, the image and meaning," end quote. So this is pure abstraction that has nothing to do with subjects. Indeed, Heron, in a Matthew Collins documentary in 1999, which is available on YouTube for those of you that are interested, described how subject matter should be the least important thing. He said that a painting fails if, in his example, is all you can say about it is, gosh, this is an apple, this is an apple, this is an apple. And that our enjoyment of art is to do with colour and shape interaction and nothing more. Heron was not just an artist, but a vocal critic and writer with numerous books, including Changing Forms of Art in 1955. And one artist he wrote about and reviewed on several occasions was his neighbour, Bryan Wynter. Further uphill from Heron's eagle's nest at the Cairn lived Bryan Wynter from 1945. This is an untitled work from 1952, and we know very little about it, but it appears to be a monotype that has then been painted over. Monotypes and monoprints were often used by Wynter due to the textural qualities they offered. The shapes and chosen colours are both bodily and of the landscape, and are certainly linked to the experience of his Cornish surroundings, helped along by mescaline and other mind-altering drugs. It is worth noting that mescaline, derived from the San Pedro cactus, was legal in the UK at the time, and that was therefore in use by many St Ives artists in post-war Cornwall. West Cornwall is often spoken about in terms of the otherworldly, dotted with megalithic tombs, with a landscape that has remained for the majority unchanged for thousands of years. Wynter's house is said to have been owned, or at least inhabited briefly, by occultist and Satanist Aleister Crowley in 1938. Whether that's true or not, it's a story weaved into local legend and still spoken about with fear today. It is that sense of the unknown and ethereal that I believe that Wynter is attempting to tap into here, with abstractions from the visions he had whilst under the influence of drugs. The sky, if it is indeed a sky, is almost psychedelic with its radiating lilac, and below there's what looks like a dark cliff being battered by sea spray. Wynter, like a handful of artists in Cornwall, never felt the need to live in St Ives, and that was the case for our next artist, Roger Hilton. This is an untitled work dated 5th of March 1973, and this is a great example of a Hilton late gouache from the early 1970s, produced in the years before he died in 1975. From late 1972 until his death, Hilton, in ill health, was confined to his bed in Retallick Cottage, and sustained himself with whiskey and cigarettes. It is strange to think of an artist so weakened creating such vibrant and energetic work. Hilton said, and I quote, "I like my colours dynamic and strongly contrasted. After all, one prefers something alive to something dead. The more alive a person or picture, the better they are," end quote. So these gouaches are mostly figurative, depicting people or animals, or take their cue from the natural world. You get a sense that this is Hilton remembering the outside world that he is now shut away from. This work hints at Hilton's increasing paranoia and the belief that his Rose was having an affair with a well-known St Ives artist, who, for the sake of this talk, will remain nameless. The central brown form is the reclining figure of Rose lying on a bed, with her arm by her side. The charcoal semicircle at the bottom left is our nameless artist's head poking out from underneath it. The shapes and forms are said to reference this artist's painting, so make of that what you will. Hilton painted these by placing his paper on the floor and sitting or leaning off the side of the bed, letting his painting hand dangle. There is, of course, a strange crossover between such vibrancy combined with a sense of sadness. Personally, I adore these works, and if you're interested, there's a superb book titled Night Letters, which is worth checking out. In the year that this work was painted, Hilton helpfully for us art historians recorded some notes about his gouaches and his reasons for selecting the medium. And we learned that it was an entirely practical consideration. He said, and I quote again, "A, it is cheap. B, it's convenient, it dries quick and allows superimposing. C, I can do it from my bed. D, the products once made can be rapidly disposed of. I mean, I don't really like looking at anything once off the production line. I prefer to get on with the next one," end quote. And sticking with Hilton's own words for a moment, he also included some insight into the childlike appearance of this series of paintings. And I quote from Hilton again here. "A woman said, seeing one of my paintings, 'That's nice. Did Fergus do it?' Fergus is my son, aged 8. One has to face the eternal problem about children's art, which is often charming and you can borrow from it. The difference is, I think, that children are essentially realists, whereas a mature painter is not, end quote. Another artist whose work is often framed as childlike or naive is Bryan Pearce, which brings me to my next slide. Often spoken about as one of the country's leading naive painters, Bryan Pearce, unlike most of the artists I've spoken about today, was Cornish and born in St Ives in 1929. The other Cornishman featured, as already explained, is Peter Lanyon. All of Pearce's work centred on his hometown, and in his career he is producing around about 12 or so works a year. Pearce lived with phenylketonuria. I'm not well versed in medical terms, but I believe that's how it's pronounced, a condition that often leads to intellectual disability. Chris Stevens, in his book, The St Ives Art and Artists, recalls the words of Alan Bowness, who said of Pearce, "Bryan lives in a world a little apart from the rest of us. This has given his work a particular innocence that in the nature of things can't be corrupted by self-consciousness," end quote. Personally, I cannot help but be cheered up by seeing a Bryan Pearce paintings. In many ways, they represent St Ives at its best. They are entirely uncynical, joyous. There's something about the colour that captures those hot summer days I remember from my own childhood. The example we see in the Cambridge Home collection is Smeaton's Lighthouse from 1996. If you know St Ives, you'll recognise this lighthouse, which sits at the end of Smeaton's Pier on the sea edge of the harbour. It was built in 1830, decommissioned in 1890, and restored to its current state following a fire in 1996, the year in which this work was painted. Pearce's work is in many ways a history of the town, and this is one example of his paintings that react to significant events that took place there. Although sometimes spoken of as an outsider artist, who is very much an integral part of the St Ives art scene, and his membership to the Penrith Society of Artists, for example, was sponsored by our next artist, Denis Mitchell. Mitchell was born in Wales, moved to Cornwall in 1930 at the age of 18. He initially dabbled in painting, but it was his introduction to Barbara Hepworth in 1949, and then a decade spent working as her assistant that made him a sculptor in his own right. There are two works by Mitchell from the collection. Firstly, Bronze, Goo from 1970. And secondly, Polished Circle with Lines, a slate relief from the year of my birth, in fact, 1987. Goo is one of the ciliars, and the word means hedge banks in translation. Both works use slate. You'll notice, for example, that Goo is set on a slate base, and it's a material that Mitchell returned to again and again. Interestingly, during the Second World War, Mitchell worked as a Bevin boy, conscripted to work at Cornwall's Geebor mine, and it was without doubt his time there that gave him his formative understanding of carving and hewing rock. In the 1987 work, there is a sense of the primitive and ancient, with those geometric shapes carved into the slate, appearing almost like pictographs found in a cave. There is a certainty to this work which reflects an artist coming towards the end of his life. He died 6 years later in 1993. We also see the influence of our next artist, John Wells. Mitchell had teamed up with Wells and became his studio mate in Newlyn in 1967. John Wells is often a bit forgotten about when we talk about St Ives, but as a founder member of the Crip Group in 1946 and of the Penrith Society of Artists in 1949, he is one of the reasons, to put it quite simply, that modern art was given a chance to flourish in the town. His invitation to Mitchell to join him at his Newlyn studio seems to have come from a crisis in confidence of wanting someone around to bounce ideas off. Mitchell commented in a letter to Ben Nicholson in 1971 that Johnny is well, but he does not do much painting. He seems to have retired. I've selected 5 squares from 1964 from the Cambridge Home collection, which you can see here. It comes from a year when many critics had decided that Wells' work had plateaued, with an exhibition at the Waddington Galleries in London showing an artist whose work had not much changed in several years, and bad sales sadly echoed this opinion. This was certainly the catalyst for his crisis in confidence, and according to a catalogue produced in the 1998 Wells retrospective at Tate St Ives, he, in his own words, was left with a paralysing depression. There is an obvious influence taken from Ben Nicholson here, and Wells wrote to him in the mid-1960s, explaining how he felt bewildered by the new artistic developments of the time, and I'll quote from that letter. "I don't know in which way painting is going. Present trends confuse me. Pop art leaves me cold. Although I often get led astray, I always wanted to return to the more formal, constructional or structurist type of work with not adhering to any rigid party line, end quote. But of course, this was the issue. Wales was regressing to a party line that had arguably already had its moments. Compare this, for example, to the 1934 Nicholson woodcut we saw earlier, and you may understand why. I do, however, have a certain fondness for this period of Wells's work, and I enjoy the quiet modesty of an artist reassessing his position and trying to find his place. Now, I'd like to finish up this talk by looking at a few examples of Cornish modernist craft from the collection, and I wanted to start with Bryan O'Casey. In O'Casey, we find one of Cornwall's most versatile artists. Not only did he paint and sculpt, but he is also a talented printmaker, poet, writer, jeweller, and textile artist. I have selected two works from the many by O'Casey in the Cambridge Home Collection, which you can see here on screen. Firstly, an untitled bronze sculpture of a fish, and secondly, a hanging sculptural piece made from silver. I have a hunch that the latter may have been intended to be worn as a necklace or similar. It seemed that O'Casey could lend his hand to anything, and was always seeking to learn and to better himself. For example, he had a series of apprenticeships with Barbara Hepworth and Denis Mitchell, which further honed his plastic sense, discovering new materials and ways of working. Jack O'Sullivan, in his Guardian obituary for O'Casey, described an approach that was about striving for simplicity. His sophistication resided in an artist who was both poetic and intent on discovering simplicity. Asked about the objects that interested him, he would respond that they were not the wood, not the tree, but the leaf, not the distant view, but the hedge, not the mountain, but the stone. This sense of simplicity of stripping things back draws a parallel with the pottery of Bernard and Janet Leach, the focus of Lynette's slide. I'm a huge admirer of Bernard and Janet Leach, and there are some superb examples in the collection. Again, there are far too many to show here, but here's a few to give you an idea of what's included. Bernard Leach first opened his pottery in St Ives in 1920, and it's still in operation today. It's quite simply one of my favourite places, and if you haven't been, let that be my tip to you for your next visit to Cornwall. So much has been said and written about Bernard Leach, and by comparison, there's very little available on Janet, so I thought I'd use this slide to focus on her work this evening. Janet was born in Texas in 1918 and studied at the Black Mountain College in North Carolina. It was there that she first met Bernard, and after a period where they worked alongside Shoji Hamada in Mashiko, Japan, Bernard and Janet married in Penzance in 1956. This is also the year that Janet moved to St Ives, and they lived in Pottery Cottage, which stands adjacent to the main pottery workshop. Emmanuel Cooper, in his book on Janet Leach, explained that her first impressions of St Ives were not exactly positive. She found it to be a remote and sleepy backwater, and she was utterly shocked to find a complete lack of avocados and grapefruits in the town's grocery shops. The vases we see on the screen are typical of those made by Janet in the 80s and 90s, partly wheel-thrown, partly coiled, black stoneware with a poured glaze to create those expressive white marks. As you can probably tell, Janet's work went against the grain of Bernard's pure Japanese-inspired form, and it's said that her work was therefore undervalued by Bernard and his disciples. As a result, much of Janet's work remained hidden or forgotten for decades. Janet's spirituality, in particular her engagement with Rudolf Steiner, could explain her unique style. Far more imperfect and organic than Bernard, she embraced the slow, gradual working of the hand rather than aiming for pure wheel-thrown Zen. As Emmanuel Cooper writes, it was about an embrace of the accidental and incidental, and this extended to her tools, and I paraphrase here. Rather than buying commercially produced tools and brushes, she made fine brushes by tying together a tuft of hair clipped from the back of a dog, or bound together dry summer grasses with a piece of string, all of which cost little or nothing. She believed this gave more pleasure and a greater sense of involvement in the decorating process. Although there was a modest retrospective at Tate St Ives in 2006, I think it's probably time for a decent reappraisal. Now onto my final slide for this evening. Before we watch our second short video and take a break before we have a chat, I wanted to use this slide to talk about the future of the Cambridge Home Collection. The collectors always have their eyes peeled for the next find, and there are many contemporary artists and makers currently on their radar. Their focus is, however, shifting to contemporary ceramics, and they are particularly impressed by the works of Gordon Baldwin, Ewan Henderson, Gillian Lowndes, and Kerry Jameson, all of which are illustrated here, and you'll see some in the next video. The images you see here are ceramic works not owned by the collectors, but should give you a flavour of the sort of things they plan to acquire in the near future. On that note, let's watch our final video. Okay, thank you very much. If we have a break now and come back here at 7 o'clock, so should give you time to grab a glass of wine and go to the loo, etc. Yeah, we'll see you back here at 7. Thank you.
Are you ready, Matt?
I'm ready. Yep.
There's a lot of questions. I think it was absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much. Have you recovered?
I have, yes. Yeah.
Okay, so we're moving about quite a lot on the questions. Have you had a chance to look at them as well?
I've not looked at them, so it's going to be a surprise.
Okay, so this has actually been asked by quite a few people. When was the start of the collection, and what year did it start, and what was the first piece that they collected, and why Cornwall?
So I know the collection started around 1995. I think, like many people, the collectors were travelling to Cornwall for holidays, etc. And I believe lived there for some time. As for the first piece, I think we've got coming through. Yeah, the typing away. Yeah, they say they really fell in love with St Ives. And the very first piece that they bought was the Alfred Wallace. As I think I said in the talk, they saw it as an entry drug, and you can absolutely see why. It's the.
And do you know when that was? Did you say?
1995.
1995. Okay, so the collection started in 1995, the Cornwall collection.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So this is one to the collectors. Which painting would they grab in a fire?
I asked them this question earlier this week, and they said, without doubt, the Alfred Wallace.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they would say that. I think they I think there's a real love of that piece because it really was the catalyst that started the entire collection of, and it's a great Wallace actually.
Yes.
Like I said in the talk, I really love those landlocked works. You know, we associate Wallace with boats and the sea and fish and fishing and stuff, but to see something that is essentially, you know, a wooded landscape is great, I think.
The colours are very different, aren't they?
Yeah.
So this again has been asked by quite a few people. Have the collectors been influenced by Kettle's Yard, or just have a similar taste to Jim Eads?
I think that living in Cambridge, you cannot help but by influenced by Jim Eads. And I think you probably would have seen in the video that there's quite a similar approach in the way that things are presented or curated, in that there is this blurring of art and life. And I think that is the key thing taken from Jim Eads, really. Obviously, Jim Eads, you know, started Kettle's Yard in the knowledge that he knew people would be visiting. And that's probably the only one of the main differences, really. In that, you know, it's very much a domestic setting. It's very much their home, and they're surrounded by the art that they love. So there's no, apart from this talk, there's never been any real intention to show off the collection in any other way. They're just things that they live with.
Yes, no, that's what's so lovely about the video, really. So this is a question to you. Someone has said they'd like to ask you what drew you to Karl Veschke's work and life, and what makes him important in the St Ives context.
Yeah, so growing up in Cornwall, I used to ask my dad, I grew up in Newquay, I used to ask my dad to take me down to exhibitions at Tate St Ives as a little precocious child. So he used to do that quite a lot. And I remember vividly seeing the Karl Veschke Beneath a Black Sky mini retrospective in 2004. And he's an artist that really sort of played on my mind. So when I started studying art, he was always there sort of in the background. And when it came to a few years ago, when I was thinking of pursuing a PhD, I felt that Karl Veschke would be the perfect artist to do, because there's so little available on him, and you know, there's a book, but it's been out of print since 1998. And it's essentially an extended essay with plates, but no one has done the business of really researching him, you know, in a PhD manner. So that is what I'm doing. So yeah, I've just entered the final year, and I'm unearthing fascinating things about Veschke, which I'm going to play sort of reasonably close to my chest, because I think it will make a great book eventually. But you know, he is one of a few people in Cornwall who are sort of sucked into St Ives' orbit, but really didn't have much to do with St Ives, in that Veschke, for example, was living in Zena and Cape Cornwall, and he is hanging out with people like Bryan Wynter, who we know was also living near Zena. He liked, you know, he had a relationship with Peter Lanyon through the St Peter's Loft School. So he's there, and I'm tracing all of these little routes and trying to find, like, where does Karl Veschke fit in all of this? He's constantly termed an outsider or spoken of as an outsider, but was that true? Or, you know, by how much was he an outsider? And I love his painting. I think he is a great painter, to put it quite simply. And yeah, I love his work. Oh,
sorry. Okay, so in Chris Stevens' book, St Ives, the Art and the Artist, he writes that St Ives was neither a homogeneous nor harmonious community, and that Lanyon was especially prone to such sectarian activities and to feeling the victim of them also. Some of these activities are well documented. Can you elaborate on some of these events and suggest how they may have impacted on Lanyon's work?
Yeah, I love that question so much. Thank you for that. Well, I suppose I'll start off by saying that modern art in St Ives is founded by people falling out. You know, I think that when people think of St Ives, they associate it as this, you know, quite beautiful tourist town, and everybody must have been marching, you know, banging the same drum, holding hands and skipping down Porthmere Beach together. But it couldn't be further from the truth. Everybody was falling out with each other all the time, and they were always at each other's throats. So, for example, if I go way back, so I mentioned the Crip group earlier. So in 1946, they broke away from the St Ives Society of Artists because they believed, in a small way, that modern art in the town wasn't being given a chance. In a much bigger way, by February 1949, 10 more artists leave the St Ives Society of Artists and form the Penwith Society of Artists. So, you know, they were founded on principles that really sort of were aiming to nurture modern art in the town. Now, the problem is with this, it was made up with very dominant voices. So you had people like Ben Nicholson, Barbara Hepworth, and Peter Lanyon as founding members. By May, so not long after, Barbara Hepworth forced through this classification system, where it was A, abstract, B, representational, and C, craft. So as an artist, you had to fit into that. Now, Lanyon did not like that at all, because all of a sudden, modern art was not seen as equal. You had to fit into a box. So he stormed off and turned his attentions really to outside of St Ives and places like Newlyn Art Gallery, and doing exhibitions there. Lanyon was, I think, an artist who always needed a battle. So he was always arguing with someone about something. And it's quite interesting in my own research, sort of charting that and how that may have had an impact on Veschke. But he even said, I hate the idea of walking around walking around St Ives and people thinking that I might look like an artist. So he thinks that people in St Ives were playing at being an artist, were, you know, stereotypically wearing a beret and having brushes in their back pocket. And he didn't like that at all. And he also didn't like that they were newcomers. He was a Cornish man who is incredibly proud of his Cornish heritage. And he just didn't like people coming in and telling him what art should be. I think that answers
Yeah, no, that's a very good answer. Thank you. So what do you think attracts the collectors to Ewan Henderson's ceramics? They're very different from Bernard Leach. You know, is it abstract qualities? What do you think?
Yeah, when I was putting the slide together, I was thinking about that, and I can see that they are typing a message as we speak. But it occurred to me that there is a relationship between Ewan Henderson ceramics and maybe Janet Leach, and that they are more organic. They are more obviously hand built.
And do they have a favourite ceramicist? so many questions are coming like this.
Yeah, they are typing now. It's hilarious. It's like yeah. So they said it links to Janet. There's a real feeling in Ewan Henderson ceramics. They like the fact that they are verging on abstract forms, and they're really into Kerry Jameson is what they're saying to me here.
Okay. So are there any textiles in their collection?
There are textiles in the collection. So I know there are textiles by Stella Benjamin, which are great. So the image that I showed of the bronze fish by Brian O'Casey, that's on a table, and then on the floor, so the yellow rug that you would have seen, I think in the publicity for this talk, actually.
It was there. Yeah.
So that is a Stella Benjamin. And interestingly, so she's made it into the new Tates and Ives collection display. So you can see Stella Benjamin's work there, and if you haven't seen it, it's well worth checking out. There was a solo show at Kessel Barton in Cornwall as well, so you can have a look on the website. As far as I know, they've just said, well, we like any old rugs. It's what they said. Very much like Kettle's Yard.
Yeah. Yes. Well, the yellow, the Stella Benjamin is beautiful. It's stunning. So this is, somebody says, it strikes me that very few of these artists are actually native to St Ives, and they are drawn there by the connections or friendships or by chance. Do you agree?
Yeah, I would agree. And I think this was, as I was saying about Peter Lanyon, like he was very conscious of that. And I think that's still the case now. And there has always been this tussle with St Ives being a tiny place and sort of native artists, for want of a better word, and incomers. This has been an argument, a debate, since way back, and is still going on today. And I think you're absolutely right. And I think that, Peter Lanyon, for example, said, Barbara and Ben are merrily on their Cornish adventure, as if it was their presence there was in a way sort of disingenuous, or it was sort of a bit of a jolly, which of course we know wasn't the case. But yeah, you're right. I think that St Ives modernism is defined by incomers.
So this is your ceramic. This is a rather lovely comment. Your ceramic collection to the collectors evoked an emotional response from this attendee. What would you say is woven through your choice of work collected? Are there as many stories that surrounds these paintings? And she goes on to say it's been a joy to see these works in situ.
Oh, good.
I think, is there, I suppose, is there a link? Does one go on from the next? Or how does that work when they're collecting?
Yeah, I'm just seeing if they're going to type something here.
It's a difficult one, really, because it's, without speaking for hours.
Again, this is something that we have touched on in our conversations, and the collectors that know what they like, and as you will see, everything sort of has a relationship to each other within the collection, and I think that's incredibly effective. So if we go back to that Alfred Wallace, which was the catalyst, and we look at the ceramics in the same breath, they are quite similar in that they are these, I sort of half poo-pooed the word earlier, but I'm going to say it, slightly primitive, handmade, honest artworks. And I think honest is probably the word to describe that collection, in that they like stuff has a bit of a story behind it, that has like an honesty to it that really links the other stuff that they collect. So they're quite into folk art, or African art, for example.
Yes.
Or, you know, they say they like old rugs, but you can imagine them going around flea markets picking up old boxes and stuff like that as well. So all of the stuff that you see within the home really.
Well, I mean, it does go on to say, somebody does say, do they use the ceramics? And I think from what you said earlier, they do, don't they?
They do. So some of them are used, and others are just for display. I suppose, you know, it'd be lovely to use a Bernard Leach, but I just couldn't bring myself to. I'd have to have it in some kind of aspic, I think.
Yeah.
But they said, yes, we absolutely use them, and we often break them. Many and most are used, is what they say.
That is lovely. That is, and that's why, you know, that's the point of the lovely plates and the Bernard Leach.
Yeah.
So again, going back to Peter Lanyon, who's obviously so you will understand this more than me. So thank you for this most interesting talk. I have seen Lanyon's construction for Lost Mine, a glass paint and Bostik and Lost Mine oil paint on canvas in the Tate Britain. And she was surprised to see a painting with a glass sculpture as an installation. She wasn't quite sure of the terminology. I was wondering if you're familiar with this work, which you are, and if you're aware of other Cornish or other artists who work in a similar manner, such as painting with a ceramic or glass sculpture. She finds it particularly exciting.
Yeah, it's a bizarre work, actually. When you look at Lanyon's body of work, those few constructions that he did, and considering that they are late constructions, it's almost as if he is sort of poking fun at the idea of it being a construction. So, I mean, the construction that is on display at Tate Britain, which the person who's asking the question is talking about, it's very ragged. You know, there might be sort of bitumen on it, or bits of tar, or it's very crudely put together. But I think it's, you know, the word construction is bandied around in terms of St Ives a lot, but I think this is really Lanyon's attempt to take ownership of that word. The word that he feels has taken over his St Ives in a way. And so he is making these strange, like you say, the bits of glass, the bits of wood, they're really, really interesting. But, you know, as the person who asked the question said, it is on display at Tate Britain at the moment. So if you do have a chance to see, it's really interesting to see that in relation to his more well-known paintings.
Okay, lovely. Someone's asked about the small in the video, the small colourful bowl on the stairs. Who's it by?
Small colourful bowl
on the stairs. Yes.
I don't know, but hopefully.
I mean, we can wait for the answer.
There we go.
Okay.
Can I say that name? Denis Shilenko.
Shilenko? Is that beginning with a T or an S?
Yeah. So TCHALENKO.
Okay.
Janice with a C.
Thank you. This person saw Art and Life at Kettle's Yard in 2014, and this is actually something that comes to light with me. She's wondered why Winifred Nicholson seems to attract so much less interest than Ben Nicholson. Do you have any views, or do the collectors have any views?
Well,
you're on the spot here.
It's probably because she's a woman, to put it quite simply.
Yes.
And we know that is a very real problem. And I absolutely adore Winifred Nicholson's paintings. But you're right, it's very rare that you can walk into a gallery, Kettle's Yard aside, and see Winifred Nicholson's curated into the show. There's loads of them out there, you know. But I think that is a real problem. We all know that is a real problem. It's a real problem of art history as well, that women artists, who should just be called artists, are getting overshadowed.
Yes,
and that's definitely happened in St Ives. I mean, look at Janet Leach, for example. It's the same. It's the same there. In the secondary.
Okay, and there's so many questions. I'm trying to work out which one. So you talked about the future of the collection. and then this person said, but what about St Ives? What's the future legacy of art and artists there?
Yeah, it's interesting. I sort of see, maybe I answer in two strands. So I think there's a lot of activity going on at the moment with a handful of art historians who work with St Ives, such as myself, but also ones such as Dr. Ian Massey, Dr. Claire Nadal, who are doing research about the St Ives that's sort of fallen through the cracks of art history. So these are not the big names, but so in Ian Massey's example, he is currently writing a book which will be published in the spring, I believe, by Riding House, about John Milne. John Milne is a St Ives sculptor. Again, never really gets a look in. So I think that given a couple of years' time, I think that the existing history, art history of St Ives will have shifted a little bit. And I think some of these overshadowed names will start to come in. And this is one of the reasons why I'm looking at Veschke, because he's drastically overshadowed. No. The other thing is, I think St Ives is changing a lot. And as someone who grew up in Cornwall, I've seen that across my life. And what's alarming is that a lot of artists are feeling pushed out of St Ives now, because as you know, it's become a bit of a playground. Rents are extortionate. So the artistic community in St Ives, I think, is a bit under threat with, there are studio networks, etc. But it's really interesting to see St Ives artists who are speaking to maybe a couple of years ago are no longer there. And that's quite worrying, I think.
I agree. So there's quite a few threads on the similar subject. So basically, what people want to know, this lovely collection, amazing collection, how can people ever see it in the flesh? Is there ever going to be an opportunity to do that? And moving on from that, how do they edit it? I mean, do they sell on from it? Is it like one in, one out, or how does it work?
I'm not sure if there will ever be, say, an exhibition. I mean, never say never. It might happen, but
we'd have to build the house, really, wouldn't we?
Yeah. I mean, for these collectors, it's really stuff they are living with. It's very personal to them. And actually, I feel that this event alone has felt like quite a big shift, actually, in showing this artwork off. And I mean, we don't know who they are, and that's very deliberate. But yeah, maybe it will happen. What's the second part of the question? Sorry.
The second one was, do they edit one in, one out? How do they? How do they build?
This is another thing I was talking to them about. So if they sell an artwork, it's only to get another a new artwork.
Okay. Yeah.
So there is that process of editing. So yeah, and they're constantly sort of reconfiguring their house to put new stuff in.
Yeah.
So nothing stays on the wall. If buy a bigger painting, stuff gets shifted around.
I mean, you did mention in our pre-chat that you said that they do have a storage facility where, well, I don't know, that under the bed, I don't know where it is, but that they do change the paintings around.
Yeah. But I think that's what you do, isn't it?
I mean, you can see that from their Instagram as well. Yeah. They do that.
If you're sort of constantly acquiring artwork, it makes sense to have a little rejig every now and again.
Yeah.
Jimmy Styley.
Well, also Jim Eads style, making it open to everyone. So, by putting it on Instagram, people can see what they have.
Yeah,
which is lovely.
And I think Jim Ead is a very big inspiration in that. Yeah. And I also like, to quote Andrew Nairn, actually, in the forward to the guides, there's this nice thing that he says about Jim Ead, in that he wanted people to come into the house and be just as enamored by the worn out broomhead as they are with the art. And I really like that. And that's the sense you get in the Cambridge Home Collection, is everything is there for a reason. Everything has a story.
Actually, this is quite an interesting. This is an anonymous. So somebody says there are unifying threads in the collection, and it makes a very coherent whole. This person visited Jim Eade in Edinburgh and Richard Hamilton in Oxfordshire and asked them both the same question, which was, if a well-meaning friend gives the collectors an object as a present that they really hate, what do they do?
I'm not sure if they have any of their own, or they're typing, so they must do.
Well, whoever asked this question said both Hamilton and Eade gave different answers that were very revealing.
I mean, it's sort of a nice problem. Like they said, they simply will not display it. There you go. That's a very straightforward answer. But I would be the same. I mean, if people know you like art, people, you know, very well-meaning people will buy you art, and it's not necessarily your taste, so you probably don't display it.
So this is a question again. Is there any dispute between, because there are two collectors here, between the two collectors regarding which piece of art to collect? Is there any dispute? I mean, we have to wait for that one.
Again, they're both typing. They said, no, it's about the emotion. So it's, if they see an artwork and they get that gut feeling, which I think is a really nice way to buy artwork. It's, if you get that gut feeling about it and you have to own it, that is why they buy it.
So so somebody's asked, where did they get their artwork from, which I think follows on from another question that someone said, you know, how do they decide to buy art? Do they go to exhibitions and then choose, but know where they're going to put it and what they're going to get rid of in order to have that? How does it work?
So again, they're typing. Again, this is the thing that I spoke to them about briefly last week. They are known to dealers, and they have relationships with dealers. So if a dealer thinks that a Cambridge home would like something in particular, or, you know, say a really nice crystal wood comes in, they will get in touch. But it's also become the relationship that dealers have become really good friends with them. So they're sort of closer to that transactionally the most. But also that thing of chance of maybe going to St Ives and seeing something in a gallery and thinking, yeah, I absolutely need that. I think that's a big thing.
Okay. Whoever asked that question said Jim Eade said that he gives them back, saying very regretfully that it didn't think he could live with the object, but Richard Hamilton puts it in a cupboard. So
yeah,
it's very interesting.
I think personally I would be more Richard Hamilton. I don't think I could just go, no, thank you.
Yeah, because the next one might be one you want. Exactly. So someone said, really interested, really agree with your comment on St Ives art. Could it be moving Newlyn way? A very interesting stuff going on there. Just returned from St Ives and really sensed a shift.
As someone who knows contemporary art in St Ives, I cannot imagine another sort of centre happening. I think that the places that we traditionally associate with art, St Ives, Newlyn, maybe even sort of Penzance, I suppose, are becoming too expensive. So I think people will be sort of scattered throughout Cornwall. And it will be interesting to see how they are framed in that instance in relation to St Ives, whether they are pulled into the orbit because St Ives has become the shorthand. So yeah, we will see, but I can't imagine that, you know, loads of artists move to Newlyn and that will be it. I think it'll be more scattered and a bit more nuanced than that.
We've got about 8 more questions. Are you okay?
Yeah. Should we do?
Sure?
Should we do until 1:45?
Yes. I'll go. Yeah.
Everybody's.
I've left the short ones.
Obviously.
I've left the short ones. So what artist's work would they, I think you did touch on this, which artist's work are they going to buy next? We'll all be out there shopping.
I mean, really, their absolute focus is on ceramic, contemporary ceramic art. And they keep saying Kerry Jameson to me. So Kerry Jameson is obviously
top of the list.
Obviously top of the list. Yeah, ceramic art. And it's interesting talking to them last week that they were saying there's sort of this return to an interest in the figurative, but that being within the ceramics as well. So you saw some examples of that, and you can see why Kerry Jameson fits into that from the image that I showed.
Okay. So what is the piece of dark, blocky colours near the end of the film on a wall in a bedroom? Is it Neil Giles?
Ooh, okay, they are typing. It's a Brian O'Casey.
It's a Bryan O'Casey.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And so someone said, okay, based on the images, they want to know if you, Matt, collect any similar works.
I mean, not to the extent that they do, but yes, I do have a few St Ives works. I've got a little.
What are you collecting then?
I've got a little Karl Veschke drawing because
yeah.
you know, when you're devoting your sort of life to him, you need to own one. I have a Sven Berlin drawing of a whippet, which he did in 1949, and obviously, to me, who's someone who's really interested in St Ives art, 1949 is that key year when the Penrith Society is set up. So it's really nice that he made it in that year. I have other things which names that people don't really think about, but if you've ever been to the Sloop pub in St Ives, the images, the caricatures on the, well, not caricatures, they're not caricatures, they're sketches of the punters were done by Hyman Segal, and I have a couple of his works. There's another artist called Isabel Heath, who was sort of based on Back Road West, where the Wallace cottage is. I have a thing by her. She worked in a camouflage factory in the war, and she did lots of drawings of factory work.
So you're starting a good collection then. It's gonna,
yeah,
you know.
And I've just glanced over to my bookshelf, but this is sort of the holy grail in my collection is a first edition copy of Sven Berlin's The Dark Monarch.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So The Dark Monarch was a roman à clay. So it was sort of thinly veiled swipe at St Ives artists by Sven Berlin. And this ended in legal action. And the publishers were ordered to gather up the copies, and they were pulped by order of the judge. So there's probably only about, they reckon, 40 of these in the world left in first edition. And there is one.
You've got one, yeah. Well, somebody does go on to say, was there more jealousy, and this is before you showed that, was there more jealousy and infighting than love between the St Ives community of artists, or are this too easy a characterization to make?
I mean, my research is showing that there was a lot of infighting, an awful lot. I think it's just a thing that happens when you're passionate. I think these were all passionate people striving for something new, and of course you're going to clash. And when you throw really big personalities into that, like Roger Hilton or Bob Law, or if you throw Francis Bacon down into the mix when he had his St Ives, his very short St Ives period, people were fighting all the time. It was happening all the time. You know, the people are getting drunk in the sloop or the castle and having fights, sometimes physical. Yeah.
So someone's asked, can you mention again the Christian name of Nadal that you mentioned along with Ian Massey, please?
Oh, Claire. Yeah.
Claire Nadal.
So, Claire Nadal was working with Hepworth's library and has been looking at Hepworth's books and what that meant for her practice.
It's interesting. There are some holes in their collection, aren't there? In
the Cambridge Home collection?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's because in recent years things have probably become extortionately expensive.
Yes.
You know, there's not many people who can afford a Barbara Hepworth now. No. For example. I just think it's one of those things that things get priced out, and with St Ives modernism, it's very much it's quite fashionable at the moment again, but it wasn't for a long period. Yes, yeah. It got a bit dusty, and people got a bit fed up with it, and but now it's having a bit of a climb up again.
Okay. So I've got 3 questions left. It would be, well, and 4 actually, just last one. It'd be very interesting to hear about the Kettle's Yard influence, obviously, if any, on the collectors. So what is the collector's approach to collecting non-art objects? Because this person saw a lot of interesting pieces of furniture were shown.
So I think all of the furniture again falls within that sort of rustic or the typing here. They say we enjoy the primitive vernacular.
Yeah.
So that obviously informs
Looked
the
a very
furniture
uncomfortable
that they have.
chair, actually.
But the most beautiful things are often the most uncomfortable. So
Yeah.
yeah, whether that's furniture, clothes.
Or, yeah.
Yeah.
So again, great quote about painting with curtains closed by a 60-watt bulb. They loved it. So when we all go on about, particularly the St Ives light, obviously an artist here, are there other St Ives myths or fantasies that you can bust like that?
St Ives myths.
So there isn't any light. What about the weather, probably?
I mean, yeah, like, I'm from Cornwall. I grew up there. Cornish weather can be terrible and relentless, and it changes on the sixpence. So yeah, it wasn't sunny all the time. We know that.
It's just your memory.
Yes, Ives myths. I'm sure there are many. I'd need to give that some thought. I can't think of any others.
I mean, it's probably not to do with that. It's more to do with the personalities, isn't it?
Yeah.
So you spoke about the future of this collection. So someone said, but what about St Ives? What's the future legacy for artists and arts there?
Yeah, I think I've already touched on this. And like I say, I'm worried. I'm worried for the future of St Ives. And I hope that artists can stay there and be successful there. But from what I've, like I say, from what I've seen in recent years, it's not looking that way, to be honest.
Yeah.
I've spoken to artists recently who are genuinely frustrated at the town of not even being able to find standing space in the pub anymore, for example. The traffic, not being able to park, just how it's become this sort of playground, I suppose, for want of a better word, and it is forcing artists out. So I am always worried about that.
Okay. Was there a conscious decision by the collectors to start this collection, or do they recall a point where it became clear that this is the path they were going on?
Okay. They are typing. No, there wasn't a conscious path. From the conversations I've had with them, I like to think that it really was that Alfred Wallace that started everything off, and it's just become this spiraling thing where they've amassed a great collection, actually. And I think that, in the research I've done for this talk, I don't think that they were fully aware of some of the contexts and connections of these artworks. And it's been a pleasure to write about them, actually, and to do the research about them, because there are some really key moments represented in that collection. In terms of art in Cornwall.
So somebody said they really liked the duffel coat hanging on the back of the door. Is there I think this is a joke. Is there a story behind the jacket? I think we'll move on from that one. So what is there? This is to do with almost the question about the whole. Is there a major artist that the collectors have yet to add to the collection? And if someone's got one for sale, can they let us know?
Just waiting for them to type.
Okay.
Yeah, they're typing.
Oh, right. If they're typing, we can come back to that one.
They would like a very, 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 very good Terry Frost, is what they're saying.
Okay. Well, has anyone got one of those for sale? Anyway, and does the collection include any of the work of Anne Stokes, Angus?
No, it doesn't.
Okay. And so everyone said fabulous presentation. And how is your PhD going?
Yeah, it's going really well, thank you. Obviously, starting a PhD and then suddenly being plunged into a pandemic has its challenges, but it's going surprisingly well. And what has kept me afloat is convincing art archives to digitize material for me. And I think without that, I probably would have had to have postponed the PhD or deferred. But it's going really well, and I've 52,000 words in, and I need 70, so I'm
almost there. So do you think would Karl Veschke have thought of himself as a Cornish artist?
I've never seen him refer to himself as a Cornish artist, but one of the things that I say in the Art UK article is he's absolutely a Cornish artist. he wasn't an artist until he moved to Cornwall in 1955.
Mm-hmm.
He was doing various things as a prisoner of war. For example, he's making a bit of sculpture. He started drawing a bit when he was doing the art history lessons at St John's College. But you know, he became a real artist when he moved to Cornwall.
And one final question. This is really to the collectors. How have they felt doing this, having this presentation done about their art, about their collection?
Yeah, they're typing.
Good.
It's been an odd experience. Very happy. Moved.
Oh.
Really pleased to have done it. Reminded.
Mm-hmm.
Loved working with Matt and Sally. Thank you.
Oh.
Thank you. We loved you. Oh, thank you.
Oh, well, that is a real honour. That is lovely, because a lot of work's gone into this. So I think everybody, I mean, when you're not going to find, I've been asked who the collectors are. It's, you know, so basically, you know, Matt is our tunnel into the collection, really, and I think we're very lucky to have seen so much of it. So Matt, thank you very much. You know, everybody. and follow on a Cambridge Home, the Instagram. The photography is amazing. It's wonderful, and also Matt has a very good Instagram page as well. I can't quite remember what it is, but it's Matt
_ Retallick.
So yes,
yeah. So do give me a follow
in case you need it.
Oh, there you go.
Okay, thank you. Everyone's saying thank you. So thank you, Matt, and good night.
Thank you. Good night. See you. Thanks a lot.
Bye.
See you.